All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, this is Colin Glover from Sarah Bren, and also joining me for this is Alexi Johnson, who is really our resident expert. Today we're covering identification authentication for small businesses. Pretty important portion of CMMC and 171 and everything else. So we'll hit a couple of ground rules first. Hopefully everybody can hear me. If you can't, or you're not seeing anything, then please hit us up in the chat window. All right, so about Sarah Bren, I think this is our 4th iteration. So if you've come here before or you're familiar with us, no big deal. We are a FedRAMP 3 PAO, and hopefully we'll become a C3 PAO under CMMC. We're all looking forward to that. A couple of caveats, and these are fairly important. We don't know your environment. We can't provide any specific detailed guidance on what you should do in your environment. If you have questions, we'll try to provide some general answers. If you have very specific questions, feel free to ask them. We may not be able to answer them here, but you can always hit us up afterwards. There's always going to be multiple methods, some concepts. So one cool thing is the CMMC auditing standard was put out. Were they leaked? Were they released? I'm not wholly sure, but they're available on the internet. So as far as that goes, and we may have mentioned it a couple of times before, so the CMMC auditing standards, as they stand now, are really heavily based on NIST 800-171A, which is the auditing standard for 800-171. It's very, very specific and detailed, and I expect documentation and specific definitions are going to be incredibly important through this process. So take a look at it and see what it's all about. All right, so we'll get into identification authentication. And Alexi, if you want to say hello.
Hello, everyone. I just want to mention that Colin was extremely nice when he mentioned that I was an expert. I don't tout myself as such, but I do like to read things, so I think that we will be able to provide you some very good information today.
All right. So we'll get started. Alexi, what is identification authentication?
Simply identification, we'll use that word first. That's just like having your driver's license. If you've ever been pulled over for a ticket, they ask you for your driver's license, and that provides identification. So in this case, identification would be something like a username or something that says digitally who you are on the system that you're trying to gain access to. And of course, authentication, that will be your credentials that go along with it, such as maybe a password or some other type of authentication mechanism that you may use.
So typically, Alexi, I mean, it seems like every computer I've ever been on, at least in the past 20 years, I have to log into it. Is that normal?
Well, it's not normal. You can actually configure computers to just allow maybe it could be configured in like a kiosk mode where you just walk up to it, it's already logged in, or you can configure it where it quite frankly has no authentication requirements at all, and anybody who walks over to it can get on it and start using it.
Okay. Let's say typically in most businesses, generally people have to log on to the computer. There's some certain circumstances where kiosks or something, like a hotel might have nothing, but generally you have to log
absolutely.
on, right? Okay.
Absolutely.
But, if you don't log on, or if there's no required logon or authentication, that's pretty bad, right?
Absolutely bad. You always want to know who's actually accessing your system, because if on the bad chance that something malicious were to happen, the government is going to want to know who had access to your system. And if nobody is logging in, you won't be able to meet your incident reporting requirements, which be on the lookout for the incident reporting webinar that'll be coming sometime in the future.
All right. So, as always, where do you start with all this?
Well, if some of you were available for the webinar that we did on access control, then you're going to notice that some of this is the exact same information. The first thing you want to do is figure out who needs access, figure out who needs access, establish some ground rules, and then enforce those rules. That's always the beginning. Access control is the mechanism that you use to determine who's going to get access to the system, and identification and authentication is the mechanism that the system is going to use to limit access to that information system.
Now, I think, probably most people are fairly familiar with the user having to log on and all those things. One of the requirements is the devices have to be authenticated. I think we talked about this here in access control, but it may be kind of weird.
Absolutely. So many people operate in an environment, and today we're really seeing that a lot during the COVID pandemic, where people are using their own personal computers to connect back into their company networks. Well, there's a requirement to actually authenticate not just a user, not just a process such as maybe a script or something that's running on behalf of a user, but also to authenticate the devices that are being used. Because you want to make sure you have trusted devices connected to your network. Many people at home, they may not have an appropriate security posture on their home system, so that can introduce a great level, a much higher level of risk to their work systems because they may not be patched appropriately. So authenticating devices is also very important.
Okay, are there some, again, let's talk, a small business, are there easy mechanisms to do some of that device authentication?
There are some basic things that can be done. Obviously, it's not one of the most secure options, but things like MAC address filtering at your network level can be used as a method to authenticate your devices. You can use things like joining your devices to your domain controller and establishing group policy that says you can't access resources unless you have a domain joined device. There are simple things like that can be done. But the big thing behind it all is just to make sure that if you know what devices are supposed to be able to connect, even if you're not limiting access to those specific devices, it puts you in a better position to determine if an erroneous device or some malicious device has been added because you've kept track of who's supposed to have access and which devices are supposed to have access. So even if you can't figure out a good way to block it, at least if you know what's supposed to have access, you can find out when something extra has joined your environment.
Good. And, another one, and you kind of mentioned it previously, to a certain extent, is, let's say, Office 365. We're all using it or some version of it. And, I can access O360, from any device. Are there things in O365 that could allow you to kind of limit what devices, or at least know what devices are authenticating to that environment?
Absolutely. So Office 365 has a couple of different products that kind of work in tandem together. So they've joined the Microsoft Intune product under their Endpoint Manager. So I won't use the term Endpoint Manager. I'll stick with the verbiage Intune. But you can couple things like Intune with conditional access such that if you don't have a device that has been joined to your Microsoft Azure Active Directory, then that device would be prohibited from gaining access to your Office 365 collaborative suite. So if you had a user, they try to log into the website, access their email from their personal device, there can actually be a check done using Microsoft's tools to determine, has this device been joined to my Azure Active Directory, which is included when you get an Office 365 account, and if that answer is no, it can actually prohibit access.
Awesome. All right, and now I think we're going to move on. Oh, okay. So required. I think we've hit on everything here.
Right.
What is NAC? I've heard of that.
NAC is Network Access Control. So a lot of small businesses generally may not have the type of network devices in place to offer network access control. It's a little bit higher degree. It gives you a higher degree of certainty that the right devices are actually connecting. 802.1x, I believe, where you can do, whether it's certificate-based authentication or you can set up some level of radius-based authentication where it's a little bit more secure than just using MAC filtering. But many of the, I don't want to say more expensive, but I think that's appropriate. Many of the more expensive hardware devices from a networking standpoint, they actually offer some level of NAC functionality. and that really puts you in a position to really hammer down on, is the right device actually connecting to my network? And there are some pretty cool devices. You may want to allow people to bring their own device. And if you have something that can provide network access control, it can say, hey, are you on the list to get access? If the answer is no, they may just be rerouted to the internet, and they'll still have at least internet access, but they won't be able to connect internally to any of your resources. So NAC is definitely a good tool, can sometimes be tough to configure, but it is definitely much better than using just MAC filtering.
Awesome. All right. And now I think this is our favorite topic, multi-factor authentication. First off, why is it important?
Well, multi-factor authentication, so I have a military background, and we used to use the word non-repudiation all the time. Non-repudiation is a fancy term that says, I have a high degree of certainty that it was you who did this. So your DNA, your fingerprint, some level of certainty is being provided that says you, the person in question, actually did this. Well, that's what multi-factor authentication attempts to provide, is a method to say, if person A, I'll just say Bill, if Bill logged into the computer using that second factor for authentication that only Bill has access to, gives a higher degree of certainty that the person logging in is actually Bill. When you only use a username and password, a single factor, you can pass out your password to anybody. Anybody may have your password and your username. So having something like a USB token that only Bill has, or maybe having a soft token through an application like Duo or Azure multi-factor authentication, that's what that provides for you. Good.
And often I hear on the news, or even somebody emailed us about today, is people, the bad guys will try to, get your password. And I think you just hit it, is even if you lose your password, if you have that second factor, you're kind of secure, right?
It is, not to be a skeptic, it is, I would say, 80 to 90% more secure. Unfortunately, with any security measure, the hackers are figuring out ways to thwart multi-factor authentication. But for the purpose of our discussion today, we're going to say if you're using multi-factor authentication, you have a reasonable degree of certainty that your account will be secure.
Awesome. All right, so looking at this, what are the requirements? And we got a couple listed here on the slideshow, but under CMMC or DFARS or even 853, what are the requirements around multi-factor authentication?
So really the line is simple. We're going to look at it in three different terms. We're going to look at privileged access. If you say privileged access, then no matter what the environment is, it all requires multi-factor authentication. So a privileged user who's standing in front of a terminal logging in requires multi-factor. A privileged user who's logging into a system over the network requires multi-factor. A privileged user who's remotely connecting, maybe across a VPN, if he's doing privileged access, it requires multi-factor authentication. For standard users, there's two different categories of what would require multi-factor authentication for you. And what it really has to do with is your authentication mechanism. If you're going to be authenticating to a local user account that's actually on the computer that you're logging into, that won't require multi-factor authentication. But the other two options, if you're going to remote into another workstation, not logging directly into it, you'll need it for remote access. And then also, if you're going to use, let's just say, Active Directory as your authentication mechanism, that's a level of network access, so it requires multi-factor authentication as well. Another example that's very similar to that is Office 365. Colin and I were actually talking about this earlier. If you may have a computer that's, I'll use the term, on a bus network, does not have any level of Active Directory, decentralized management and control, your regular users can simply log in, not require multi-factor authentication. However, once they access their cloud resources, they require the use of the network to gain access to those systems. Now, that's where the MFA must be invoked to prove that the right person actually logged into those resources.
And for that cloud situation, just thinking through it, whether it be Microsoft or Google, they both offer native multi-factor at this point, don't they?
Absolutely, and it's in most cases it's free. If you have Google Cloud and you're using Gmail as your platform, now obviously not at gmail.com, but using Gmail's hosted email solution, they do have a native solution that can provide you an app that can go on your phone, and they also give you the ability to use hardware tokens as well if you don't want to use, personal mobile devices to get that soft token on an app. And Microsoft does the same thing. And I would recommend, whether business or at home, if you're using those types of systems, you can much better protect what you have going on if you would simply turn on the free multi-factor authentication that comes with those products.
Now, from a general perspective, and take a typical business environment with Active Directory and everything else, what's so hard about getting MFA in place?
Typically, the only hard thing about it, and I won't say hard, most of the time it's cost. It's a lot of instances it may be cost prohibitive to actually get MFA installed, but there's really not, today, there's not a difficult approach to actually getting multi-factor authentication installed. Many of the providers have created, such easy manuals and such easy one-step, two-step processes to actually get MFA configured in your environment to where it's not very difficult at all anymore.
Very good. And so, and I see there's a question, we'll get to that in a second. But say there's an application or a database server or a file server. Do I have to MFA into that as well?
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time?
Sure. So say I have to get to the file server. I'm on an Active Directory environment. I need to go to my file server. Is MFA required at the file server level too? Or is it just once I'm at the boundary?
Once you've actually MFA'd to log into the computer, then MFA would not be required to access the file server, because your access to the file server will still be using the same account that you've already logged into. Now, a scenario where you would have to MFA into the file server would be one where maybe you're using a computer, and this may partially answer the question, one of the questions that's been provided. If you're using a computer and using a local logon to get onto that computer, you're not going to have to MFA to get in. But if you want to pivot to a file server that's a part of an Active Directory domain, you're going to be prompted to enter some credentials. And at that point, you will be required to enter MFA because you're using the network to authenticate into a resource at that moment. So really, and like I said, that plays into the question that's being asked, does every computer inside require MFA? The MFA is based on what the account is actually gaining access to and how that access is being granted. If a network resource, a la a domain controller, is required for you to log into the account, MFA is required. If a local SAM database, security account manager, I believe that stands for, the local computer, if the account resides there, MFA is not required if it's not privileged access. But to be safe, I think it would be more appropriate that if you operate in a domain environment, use MFA for everything. You'll be 100% safe in that case.
And so this is on the same note, and I'm not sure if you're looking at it. This is from Brian, and this is one of our favorite conversations, I think, Alexi. If you have users that do not access CUI, are they required to have MFA as well?
Absolutely. The Department of Defense has published in their frequently asked questions that the only thing that can prevent you from requiring MFA to access your system is based off of the authentication method and whether it requires network access or not. A local system, no access is required or no MFA is required, but if you're using Active Directory or some cloud resource as an authentication method, all of those things require multi-factor. And of course, remember, all privileged access requires it no matter what. As a matter of fact, I'll actually post a link to those DoD frequently asked questions inside of the chat window for all to see.
Great. Now, one question, just on that same topic though, is say they had separate VLANs throughout the environment. Could some users not have MFA if they didn't have logical access to a CUI environment?
You know, that's a great question. So in that type of environment, So what Colin is referring to is having some level of segmentation or some level of separate security domain within your environment. And if you can show technically that you have isolated your security domains such that the CUI is on one security domain and the non-CUI or the access to the non-CUI is on a separate security domain. And I don't want to confuse the word domain in this case with Active Directory domain, just from a pure security domain sense. Then you would not require MFA for those users. But if they're operating on the same segment of network that has access to the CUI environment, generally a security domain has some level of boundary device. So most of the time the boundary devices that we use are firewall devices. So normally VLANs in most cases aren't sufficient unless you can have an appropriate boundary device in place. Because what you have to think about is Active Directory, a single Active Directory can traverse multiple VLANs. But if you have some level of firewalling technology to prevent that, then you may be able to do it. But that type of question speaks to an exact implementation. So we don't want to necessarily give a definitive answer on that because we may lead you down the wrong path. That would be something, not to offer a sales pitch, but that would be something where we would really need to look at what your environment is and provide some consult on that to make sure that what we're offering you is the appropriate approach.
But, and just the reason I asked the question is there are options, though, if it's
oh, absolutely.
a very complex environment. Yeah.
Absolutely. Definitely there are several options out there. You're not required to do your full environment if you can create an enclave that can allow your CUI data and all of the account access and access control and identification authentication. If you can isolate that to one segment and have a boundary in front of it, you could very well just keep all your CUI in that environment, do all your multi-factor in that environment, and leave the rest of the business alone.
And Brian, I see your follow-up question. I think we'd have to look at your network boundaries to give you a legitimate answer. If you have specific questions, feel free to reach out and we can talk through that with you if you'd like. So as far, because this comes up a bit and is actually addressed in the link, and Lexi, if you want to dig that link out, I'll go ahead and answer this one. So I've heard it quite a few times that, I work in a secure facility. There's armed guards out front. We get retina scans to get in that facility. Can that be part of my multi-factor? And the answer is no. Multi-factor is how you authenticate to that environment, to that system. So yeah, you could work at NSA, and it doesn't matter. You're still going to have to multi-factor to that computer. And it's something you have, something you know, or something you are. So it could be biometrics. It can be a password or PIN, and then it can be an external device, like a cell phone, hardware token, something like that. In DoD land and the rest of the federal government, they use CACs, the Common Access Card, or the PIV, which is Personal Identifiable Verification, something like that, a PIV card. It has to be authentication to that information system, which is where the MFA applies. So just because you work in a super secure facility and everybody knows each other, that can't be part of your MFA solution. And Alexi just posted that link up there. If you've never seen the DoD Frequently Asked Questions guide, it's awesome. It's in depth. They take a lot of use cases and go through them and really provide some solid background on how we got there and certain things you can and cannot do. So multi-factor is covered a lot in that one. One of the things that we really don't talk about too often, and Alexi, jump in on this, is phones and other mobile devices. You don't have to MFA to your company email on your phone. Your phone has to be encrypted, but you don't have to MFA to Outlook on your phone. If you are, however, using a phone or another mobile device, a tablet, what have you, to access other company resources, there should be MFA at that point. So if you're if you have to go to SharePoint on O365, at that point, you should have to MFA. You think, is that right, Alexi?
Oh, absolutely. And Microsoft has tools in place to easily allow you to configure those very things based on the type of device that you're actually accessing the resources from. So it would not be a huge lift. As a matter of fact, our company devices do just that. You know, if I try to access our internal resources from my mobile device, I'll be prompted to enter an MFA token or some type of request to gain access to it.
All right. So I think we've about beaten that dead horse. Again, if you have specific questions about specific configurations, feel free to reach out. But bottom line, MFA is required everywhere. There are some, putting it in place isn't that hard. I know there are certain companies out there that are free for less than 10 users, aren't there?
Absolutely. So what you're referring to there is Duo MFA. Duo has been purchased by Cisco, so now they offer a few additional features, but just at its basic level, if you are a small business and all you have is up to 10 users, and that 10 users would include administrators as well, you can actually get MFA set up absolutely for free. And
so Duo, I know it integrates with Active Directory, but you can also do it via an app on your computer, right?
Absolutely. So if you do not have Active Directory, you can actually install an application. Duo gives you the ability to protect just about anything that's out there. Duo has a guide that tells you how to do it, but you can install an application on your workstation, and as soon as a user types in their credentials to log in, immediately before they're allowed to proceed, they will receive a prompt for their multi-factor authentication, whether it be token or whether it be a one-time password. And if you don't enter that information, it's going to log you right back off until you can get that in there. So they've made it very easy to allow access to MFA in most cases using a lot of the industry standard things. And I definitely, if you have a small environment, I'm not trying to upsell Duo. I don't get any kickbacks or anything, but they do provide a pretty good product.
And for the Active Directory environments, the Azure MFA is kind of compelling, isn't it?
I'm sorry, say that one.
For companies with Azure Active Directory, the Microsoft Azure AD MFA solution is out there and available, right?
Absolutely, and it works very well. I think the only problem that you would have with the Azure MFA is if you have to have MFA at the workstation level, as many of you may have an Active Directory domain, it would not provide multi-factor authentication to allow you to locally log on to the workstation. It would be great if Microsoft would add that feature in. I know I personally have requested it, but it's a much further implementation that you have to do if you want to allow Azure MFA to be used in conjunction with your regular local logon.
Yeah, sorry. Azure AD MFA is not plug and play for local logon, but with the MFA server and the certificate authority, it can be done, correct?
Oh, absolutely. It can be done. It's simple if you have somebody who has some network access, not network access control, network policy server radius experience, because that'll be a part of the requirement. But it is a fairly straightforward process, and they have white papers and documentation that walks you straight through the process.
Awesome. All right. Cool.
For those who tried to hit that link, I'm going to post it one more time. I don't know what I was doing, but for some reason, I was combining everything together, so I just posted the link to the DoD frequently asked questions one more time, and I think this link should work for you. We secure networks. We don't often use our computers correctly. That's just a joke. We're okay.
and Mark, as far as Duo, last time I checked, and things certainly could have changed, Duo offered, I believe it was up to 10 users. You could use their app, and then you would put the local application on the system. I don't believe it's for a AD type environment where it would be successful. Again, it would be at the local level that you can use Duo.
But so just so you know, Mark, it's DUO. But here's why it's free. Realistically, it's purely marketing. If you're familiar with technologies like Zoom and WebEx, all of them offer some level of free account, But some of the features that, you know, as you start using something free and you decide that you want to grow, you're going to quickly find out that, okay, I just hit 11 people. I've already implemented Duo. It works great. Do I want to pull it all out and go find another solution, or do I want to just go ahead and start paying for it? So they're doing that free piece because they know you may start out with 10, but once you get to 15, now you're paying $3 per user per month for those extra 5. So that's why they keep those things free for you, because they know that they can get you hooked off of it if you just start using it at least once. And I can say it is a very good product. I'm an adjunct professor at a local local college here, and we use Duo for MFA as well. You know, so I've used it in many different environments. There are several other amazing products out there as well. I just so happen to have used Duo MFA, Azur MFA, and Google Authenticator a lot, so I can tell you that those products work very well.
Yeah, as Alexa mentioned, there are some other great products out there that are very robust, and some of them are fairly easy to get into place, and some are more secure than others. So, you know, don't just restrict yourself to what we've mentioned here. There's plenty of good vendors out there for it. All right. We're going to move on to the other identification authentication requirements. These are kind of, a lot of them are policy driven. So you got to define how long an inactive account will be maintained. So for instance, not only when somebody leaves, but this may often come up. A prime example would be some sort of medical leave where they may be out for 3 or 4 months. Do you leave that account active on your system, or is it something you disable? An identifier, this one always comes up. Really what they're looking at, they say identifier, it's not the SID, although that's a good reference point, but they're actually talking about the username. So if you have John Smith working there, John Smith leaves, will there be some sort of lapse between reissuing the John Smith username? That has to be identified somewhere. Replay resistance, what's that?
So replay resistance is all about protecting from things like man-in-the-middle attacks, stuff like that, or I'm sorry, not man-in-the-middle. You can actually capture somebody's credentials across the wire, and if you capture them appropriately, you can just replay those credentials and actually gain access to network resources. So you're generally protected from replay resistance if you're using a modern operating system. I can't remember the name of the certification, but it's some level of Common Core certification, and replay resistance and reuse technology are two things that are included in that Common Core certification, and Microsoft has maintained that Common Core certification for every version of Windows starting with XP out until now. So obviously if it's end of life, you want to stop using it. But all of the modern operating systems by Microsoft that are still supported, and many of the Linux, Unix flavors, all support replay resistance technology.
Awesome. And I think it's Pass the Hash, that's what it's called? Yes,
absolutely. Immediately my mind went to man in the middle, but absolutely. It's called capturing the hash and then passing it along to gain access to resources. But how can you stop replay resistance as well? By utilizing multi-factor authentication, because they may get one part of the equation, but if they don't get the second part, they still can't do anything.
Great. And here's one of my favorite questions. I think we see it a lot. Is how often do passwords have to be changed?
You know, the DoD background in me cringes at the thought of this question. I'm used to the 60-day password changes, but NIST is actually putting new standards out that I don't remember all of them verbatim, but technically, well, at least from a NIST standpoint, there is no requirement for when you need to change your password. They often recommend today that you change it if you suspect compromise, or obviously you issue somebody an account and they log in, they immediately change the password. But after that, they recommend that you use some system for complexity, and also making sure that your passwords aren't dictionary based or aren't simple passwords, but they don't actually tell you change your password anymore, because they know that a changed password that's too complex is a written under the keyboard password.
Mm-hmm. So realistically, you know, there has to be some mechanism to check for those dictionary passwords or other bad passwords or or known bad passwords?
Absolutely.
Are there resources out there for that?
Absolutely. So we've been talking about Azur MFA, and I'm sure that many of you are using, if you're using Active Directory, you're probably also using Office 365 because that's the easier path to getting things done when you're a small business. So what you can do is you can research where Microsoft has published documentation that shows you how to synchronize your Active Directory servers with the Azur MFA password implementation such that you can never require your passwords to expire, and you can meet all of the requirements. I believe it's NIST 863. It's A, B, or C. I don't remember exactly which one. But you can actually find white papers to tell you exactly how to configure your domain to use Azur MFA as its password manager, such that if somebody tries to put in a password that's a commonly used password or something that's susceptible to a dictionary attack, it'll actually prevent you from using that password.
Awesome. And I think you mentioned just a second ago, but when a user first gets their password, or maybe even when they have to change their password, what's the process for that supposed to be like? The temporary password concept.
Once you get, once a user signs up, once a user's account has been created, you can create a temporary password that may not even meet the complexity requirements, but that temporary password has to be changed as soon as they log in. You give them a password of temp435 or whatever it is. Immediately, they need to change that password. But I'll just mention this one additional thing. One thing you don't want to do is send that password in the clear unless they're readily available to receive the password and use it right away, because there have been research has shown that some systems have been compromised because passwords were intercepted when they were sent via email in the clear, and then people were able to gain access to systems. Not necessarily what we're talking about here, but it's something that you want to think about when you're thinking about sending passwords in the clear.
Now, I want to jump down to password encryption. Now, Windows stores password, should store it encrypted, right?
Absolutely. So when you see encrypt passwords, it's not normally talking about you emailing passwords. So you have to remember that this is all under the guise of identification and authentication. So when it's talking about encrypting your passwords, it's talking about making sure that the mechanisms that are used to provide the authentication process, that they're encrypting your passwords in two forms or in two instances, when they're being stored and when they're being transmitted. So if you're using, again, one of the modern operating systems that fall under the Common Core criteria, they often store their passwords using some level of one-way hash, whether it's in Active Directory or whether it's in the local SAM database. And once you enter the password, it uses the same one-way hash function, and it does a comparison of the hashes. And if the hashes match, it says your password is good. So it doesn't actually send your password in the clear. It sends the calculated hash across the wire, and that's what's checked in Active Directory to validate that you're good. If you remember earlier when we were talking about the replay resistance and pass-to-hash, that's where pass-to-hash attacks come from, because your password isn't transmitted. A hash of your password is transmitted.
Now, so you mentioned the common criteria. So typically Windows or Linux computers or obviously Mac, Apple Mac computers are fine. Are all network devices set up for common criteria? Is everything?
All devices are not set up for common criteria. So this is where the fun comes in. So oftentimes small businesses are guilty of getting what can be afforded, but sometimes it may, you just want to at least talk to somebody who can give you good guidance on whether or not the devices that you're going to be using meet these requirements, because if you were to hit a CMMC audit and your auditor finds that a network device that you're using stores all passwords in the clear, you're going to fail the certification process, all because you decided to not spend the extra $40 for the next higher level up device. So you really, that's a great question, Colin. You really want to look into the types of devices that you're putting on your network because they can be the difference in CMMC level 3 and not.
And it seems, we spend so much time talking about computers that we forget about all these other computing devices that we may be responsible for.
Absolutely. Potentially multifunction devices, depending on how you use them. they could be susceptible to this as well. You know, obviously your network devices for sure, most of the times the firewalls are good, but if you have managed switches, you may want to consider the types of managed switches that you're using to make sure that they meet those requirements as well. And if I'm not mistaken, this is outside of what we're talking about, but CMMC has also now said that if you're going to manage a network device across the wire, that has to be an encrypted communication now. So there are different things that you want to make sure you're thinking about as you're deciding which hardware devices, which devices in general you're going to use in your environment to make sure that they can meet the requirements.
Awesome. All right. And I think that's all we had to talk about for identification authentication today. But we'll stay on here and answer any questions that come through.
I'm going to go ahead and drop our email address out there, Colin, in the event that anybody wants to follow up and ask us a question.
Sure.
I know sometimes this environment may not suit how everyone wants to ask questions, but
of course,
we're very friendly people, and we'll let you know if it gets to a place where we need a statement of work, but we'll try to support, some of your questions as best we can through email process as well.
Yeah, if they're quick questions, we'll try to get your response. Any solution for password encryption? I'm not sure exactly what you mean on that one. So one of the things that I come across a lot, and I'm sure Alexi does too, is not just system passwords, but people have so many websites and other requirements, and that tends to lead to people writing down their passwords or storing them on their desktop or something like that. And I've become a huge fan of password managers. I think we see in the news all the time where password managers are vulnerable or have been popped. So we go back to that old MFA. If you go with a password manager, make sure it supports multi-factor. One thing maybe, Alexi, you could talk about a little bit would be either PAM or PEM. I think those are important for some of the bigger environments.
Absolutely. So a privileged access manager is basically a system that brokers access when it's needed. So if you operate in an environment and you don't want to have to worry about remembering a lot of different passwords, your administrators can actually request credentials when they need them, perform the task that they need to perform, and then the password will be wiped out. And then when they need to use it again, they can keep going through that same process over and over again. So in that environment, you really don't have to remember passwords because the passwords are kind of provided to you one time for the task that you need it for. Now, that's a culture change. You can definitely, you can make your administrators very upset if you push that type of process, but culture can easily change through continued discussion and education on what the processes are going to be. But PAM solutions, they're pretty good. So what I did was I posted a link from Gartner, which is a company that does research on multiple types of products, and I put one out there for Gartner's information on different MFA services, but you can actually look up privileged access manager solutions, and Gartner will give you more information about the different types of products, some of the pros and cons on that as well. If you don't use Gartner as a resource, I would definitely look into some of the things that they offer, because we use it a lot when we're asked to provide advisement to our clients on different types of products. Many times we'll start with a Gartner report to see what research they've already done, and then we'll further refine that through digging into that particular company's website. And
in question to Linda, or an answer to Linda, I found it via LinkedIn is the route I took to find it. I'll see if I can dig up the link and post it out there for folks.
And I will, just because of what Colin just mentioned, isn't it crazy? It seems like LinkedIn has become the authoritative source for all things related to CMMC. I don't know if you all are noticing the same thing, but I follow the hashtag CMMC on LinkedIn, and every day I get new information regarding CMMC. So it's always interesting. If you're not on LinkedIn looking for CMMC information, I'd recommend that you definitely get out there and you follow the hashtag CMMC. Because sometimes that's the fastest way to get information. And then, of course, if you find yourself in a position, another shameless plug, you find yourself in a position and you don't understand what you're looking at, feel free to contact us at Cerebrand.
Yeah, and Brian's right. Reddit's a great source. if you're really interested in CMMC and this and everything else, and not to, hopefully it doesn't blow it up, but there is a Discord channel off of Reddit under, I think it's Government Cyber or something like that, that is very, very active and provides a wealth of information from a wealth of various folks. So if you have an opportunity and you're interested, I would check that out.
Yeah, I'd say that Reddit is a good source for pretty much everything nowadays. Reddit's amazing.
So, all right. So we'll hang out for a couple minutes. I don't see any other questions coming in, but we'll hang out for a couple minutes. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to hit us up. But we'll give it a couple minutes and then we'll sign off. Thanks, everybody.
Final comment that I'll make is we're both also on LinkedIn. So if you'd like to connect with us out there, you know, to get more information about different events that we're doing, speaking engagements that one of the members of our team may have, things like that, feel free to look us up, you know, both company and maybe individually as well. And we, you know, definitely connect with you out there also.
Yeah, okay.
That is a great question. I love that question.
That's our favorite.
Yeah, I love that question. So let me answer the bottom one first. So when you talk about storing passwords, a password isn't CUI. And when you talk about encrypting passwords, that's talking about making sure that your passwords are encrypted in terms of your authentication mechanism. But it's just good practice as well that if you're going to have a list of passwords, that you store those encrypted as well. And what we use is a credential manager in most cases. You know, I personally use LastPass because they're one of the ones that hadn't suffered a breach yet, or at least they haven't reported one. But there are several products. One that is on the tip of my forehead, and I can't think of the name, but there are products that you can purchase that you can actually deploy in your environment as a password vault actually on your network, and you can share passwords amongst your administrators and keep them, you know, if you just want the desktop version or if you want the server version, there are products. So if you'd send me an email and ask me that question, I have that information already in an email. I just need to go back and find it, and then I can shoot that over to you. But as far as your other question, how to provide security to common computers used by multiple users on the shop floor, well, there's two answers to that question. One answer to that question is if isolated from the authorization boundary, if you plan on using it as a shared system and don't actually allow it to have access to the rest of your network. So some companies use things like timekeeping, various shared resources like that. If that's what's happening, you want to isolate that from your standard environment and just give it access to what it needs access to. But if you're talking about an environment where maybe you have a Windows computer and multiple users need to walk up to it, unfortunately, this may be the answer that you don't want, but everybody has to log in and log out, and they have to use their own username and password and multi-factor authentication if that system is going to be within your authorization boundary. You know, there's really no way around that. If you want to do anything outside of that, the best thing that you can do is to isolate it. You know, we've worked with a company that needed to do that very thing. So what they decided to do was they operated two firewalls. So what they did was they connected the port for that particular computer to a different switch, and it ran through a different firewall port. It was completely isolated at that point. So now they left it open. People could go over and clock in, clock out, submit time cards, request pay statements, things like that. They could do whatever they needed to do because it was isolated from their authorization boundary or their security domain that contains CUI. But you can't operate those shared systems because you also have a reporting requirement that you have to be able to meet if there is an incident that occurs, and it's, you know, nearly impossible to meet the control that says ensure that you can tie actions to an individual in your environment. You know, so once we get to the auditing standards, we'll be able to talk about that. But you have to be able to tie actions to an individual account, and when you're operating in a shared space, you can't do that. I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, please provide follow-up because, you know, we understand that this isn't the language that everybody speaks, so just trying to offer it in a way that makes sense is what the whole purpose of us doing this.
Yeah, and that's part of it, and we've come across it in a lot of places. Is you look at it the first time, whatever standard it may be, and it's just gobbledygook the first time you look at it. You look at it the second time and you pick certain things out, but it's not until you start really digging into it that the controls have any context. And if you don't have time, you have to make the time to really look through the documentation and look through the requirements to understand what's requested of you. So, I really advise folks to get onto Reddit, to look at the procurement toolbox, to go through everything, to understand what's required before you just kind of throw up your hands and walk away from it. At the end of the day, these are good security requirements, whether it be protecting DoD information, which is why we're all here, or protecting your company from ransomware. This is going to help you. Brian, Alexi posted it up earlier in the frequently asked questions guide.
I have the link there, so I'll just go ahead and drop it to the bottom.
All right.
There it is. So I also wanted to, you know what, I just lost the thought, disregard. Oh, I'm sorry, I remember now. So the main thing that you want to remember here as well is that you don't want to look at any one control in isolation. The whole concept behind best security practices, they all consider what's called defense in depth. Just for example, if you want to stop somebody from getting in your house, there are multiple things that you can do to stop them from getting in. Obviously, you have your front door, but you could also put a gate around your house. That's layers of defenses. So when you think that way, you understand that I cross-referenced an auditing control, when I talked about operating a shared computer. So yes, you have your identification and authentication requirements. Yes, you have your access control requirements, but you also have your auditing requirements. So they created this with like a layered defense approach. So just don't think about when you're trying to solve or satisfy the requirements with controls, just make sure your controls take into account a holistic approach so that what you do to satisfy one control doesn't break another control. So you really want to take a step back at some point and say, okay, let me make sure that this isn't violating another control and satisfying. Okay, all right, just take it one step back again. All right, now it looks like I'm satisfying all of my controls with what I'm doing. And that's really where you want to get yourself at, because, we have seen it where you're trying to do one thing and then you break something else and you don't find out until 6 months down the line.
All right. I think we'll go ahead and end it there. Thank you, Alexi. As always, this has been great. I really appreciate everything. So last question. It could cause an issue. Typically, you have to, I know with MFA, you typically have to get an application password, but AD integrates really well with PKI. So I'm not 100% sure if there would be an immediate effect. YubiKey can be used for PKI. It has other mechanisms as well. YubiKey, you can go with an app. If you go with the app, then it's just for the authentication and won't affect Outlook. If you use PKI and YubiKey, I'm not sure.
So I'm thinking about it. We actually have a couple clients who do this, and using YubiKey, it only affected their system on logon, and it didn't affect, the ability to use their username and password in other instances. So it would be a separate authentication mechanism. It would pass if you have a single sign-on set up such that the account that you're logging into your computer with, those credentials would still be passed to Microsoft Outlook, and it wouldn't affect that authentication unless you set it up to affect that authentication, because YubiKey can be configured for Windows logon, but that doesn't mean that those credentials are going to pass through, or the requirement for MFA is going to automatically pass through with it unless you actually configure your system to do that. Just as
Awesome.
For example, when I was military, we always used our common access card to log in, but if we went to certain websites, we had to use it again. But if I opened Outlook, it just passed a credential through, and I didn't use it to get in Outlook. I only used it if I had to maybe digitally sign something. I had to enter my credentials again, but just getting in my mailbox, it wasn't required.
Perfect. All right. Well, I think we'll end it there. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a wonderful rest of your day. You have our emails as well as the info@cerebrin.com. Please feel free to reach out directly if you have any specific questions. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Have a good one.